Hello guys, welcome back to MedLife. So in this video, we are going to talk about cerebrum and its functional areas. So the brain has three major parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. So this part of the brain, which has sulci and gyri, is the largest part of the brain. It's called cerebrum. And this one on the posterior surface of the brain is cerebellum, and this one in the inferior surface, which passes through foramen magnum, it's called brainstem, which is also divided into three different parts: the midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata. But in this video, we're going to focus on cerebrum, this part, cerebrum. Yeah, the cerebrum has two main divisions. It's divided into two parts, two hemispheres, right and left hemispheres. And they're separated by this green fissure that you can see in this picture. This is called the longitudinal cerebral fissure. It separates the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere. And the way the brain functions is the fibers from the right cerebral hemispheres control the left half of the body, and the fibers from left cerebral hemisphere control the right half of the body. Now, the cerebrum has four major lobes. This is from a lateral view. So this is anterior and this is posterior. So in the anterior, we have the frontal lobe, this one right over here, the most anterior part, frontal lobe. Then posterior to that, we have parietal lobe. And then posterior to that, we have occipital lobe. And inferior to parietal lobe, we have the temporal lobe. It's just kind of named according to the bones they're attached to. So we have the frontal bone here, and parietal bones here, and occipital bone here in the posterior surface, and the temporal bone that comes here lateral to this these lobes. So these are the four major lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Now, what are sulci and gyri? So gyri, the cerebrum has complicated series of tortuous folds called gyri. So if you look at this picture, these masses in the brain that are folded in different hemispheres, in different lobes, we can see them everywhere. These ones are called gyri. And sulci are the grooves and depressions between these gyri. So if we said that these masses are gyri, these fissures in between and these grooves are sulci. So this is a gyrus, this is a sulcus. So every gyrus consists of a central core of white matter covered by an outer layer of gray matter. So in the brain, in cerebrum, we have both gray matter and white matter. The white matter is inside the inner surface. The outer surface is the gray matter. Okay, now let's talk about some major sulci. Then we'll go to gyri and sulci deep in each lobe. So central sulcus. This is the central sulcus. This is the sulcus that separates the frontal lobe of cerebrum from, this is a frontal lobe, the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This blue one over here is the parietal lobe, and this is the frontal lobe. So the central sulcus, this red fissure over here, separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, this one over here. It separates parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. That's why it's named parieto-occipital lobe. Then we have the lateral lobe, lateral sulcus or lateral fissure. It's the same thing, lateral fissure. This separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe, and also the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. So now let's discuss about the gyri and sulci in the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe, basically first, if we said this is the central sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So this is the central sulcus. So anterior to central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus. This gyrus over here is the precentral gyrus. Then we have three major gyri in the frontal lobe: superior frontal, middle frontal, inferior frontal. Superior because it's at the top, it's the most superior. Then this one is in the middle and this one is down, so it's inferior. Superior, middle, inferior frontal gyri. And they're separated by superior frontal sulcus, this red one over here. And the middle and inferior are separated by the inferior frontal sulcus, this one over here. And in the inferior frontal gyrus, we have three other parts, which are called pars opercularis, pars triangularis, and pars orbitalis. They have different functions to perform and to do. Now let's go to parietal lobe. We said parietal lobe is posterior to frontal lobe. This is the central sulcus. Posterior to central sulcus, we have the post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus. This one over here. Then we have the superior parietal lobule, and then we have the inferior parietal lobule, or we can call them gyri, inferior parietal gyri and superior parietal gyri, or lobules. So this thing here is the superior parietal, and this one is the inferior parietal, and they're separated. Superior and inferior are separated from each other by intraparietal sulcus. This one over here, intraparietal sulcus. And then the post-central gyrus is separated from the superior and inferior lobules by this sulcus, post-central sulcus. Post-central sulcus. And then this is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe. This view is from posterior. So we see the occipital lobe here. So first of all, we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Then this lobe has also three major gyri: superior occipital, middle occipital, and inferior occipital. Just like frontal, superior frontal, middle frontal, and inferior frontal, this one has superior occipital, middle occipital, and inferior occipital. And here is the intra-occipital sulcus, which separates the superior occipital from the middle occipital. Intra-occipital sulcus. Then the inferior occipital sulcus is the one that separates the inferior occipital gyrus from the middle occipital gyrus. And the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, the sulcus, or the fissure that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe, is the lateral fissure, or the lateral sulcus, this green one over here. Then in this one also, just like frontal lobe and occipital lobe, we have three gyri: superior temporal, middle temporal, and inferior temporal. Superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus, and inferior temporal gyrus, as you can see in this picture. And the sulci that separate them is just like frontal. We have superior temporal sulcus, inferior temporal sulcus, that separates these three from each other. Now let's discuss about the functional areas. So a neurologist called Brodmann discovered some areas in the brain which are specific for some specific functions, to perform different and varieties of functions in the brain. And he divided them into 47 areas, which are known today as the Brodmann's areas. So basically, these areas have three main functions, these functional areas: one, motor function; two, sensory function; and three, association areas. So the motor ones are the ones that are concerned with the motor functions. So the sensory ones are the ones that receive the information and take it to the brain. From the peripheral nervous system, they take it to the central nervous system. And the motor ones take the response of that stimulus from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. But the association ones are different. They're not concerned with any primary motor or primary sensory. They're different. They have important associative, integrative, and cognitive functions, like comprehension and other complicated stuff. So you can see some of the most important functional areas in this picture. So this is a premotor area, primary motor area, primary somatosensory area. Then we have the visual association area, primary visual area, and we have the sensory speech area of Wernicke's area, and we have the secondary auditory area and Broca's area, primary auditory area, frontal eye field area, and prefrontal area. So we're going to talk about each of them separately. Let's start with primary motor area, area 4, which in this picture you can see right over here. This is located, now we're talking about the frontal lobe. They're located in the frontal lobe. So this line in the middle, this one is the central sulcus, which is separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. The number 4 is the primary motor area. In this motor area, the human body is represented upside down. Like the uppermost part of controls the feet, and the lowermost part controls the head, neck, face, and fingers. So it's like this. So the upper part, the superior part, is it controls the feet. Like it's just the opposite way. It's coming from down to up, like first feet, then lower limb, then it comes up to head and neck down here, then the upper limb, fingers, and hands. Then we have the premotor area, which is area 6. This one is responsible for successful performance of the voluntary motor activities initiated in the primary motor area. So this is just to make sure that the voluntary motor activities are doing well and they're performing well. This area over here, this premotor number 6, this number 6. And frontal eye field area, which is area 8 of Brodmann. It is responsible for conjugate movements of the eyes to the opposite side. So if it's in the right hemisphere, it controls the left eye. And if it's in the left hemisphere, it controls the right eye. And the Broca's area, yeah, Broca's motor speech area. This one is the motor speech area, and it's located, as we just said, in the pars triangularis, area 44 and 45. In pars triangularis and pars opercularis of the inferior frontal gyrus of the frontal lobe, which we just discussed, and we can go through it again, this part over here. So area 44 and 45, pars triangularis and pars opercularis. And it controls just the opposite hemispheres. And then we have the primary sensory area. This area is concerned with perception of exteroceptive, like pain, touch, and temperature, and also like proprioceptive, like vibration, muscle, and like joint sense, things like that. Pain, touch, temperature, vibration, things related to that. This is called primary sensory area, which is areas 1, 2, and 3 of Brodmann, which in this picture you can see this one, primary somatosensory area. Pain, touch, temperature, they're all related to this area over here. And then we have the sensory association area. This one is concerned with the perception of shape, size, roughness, and texture of the objects. Thus, it enables the individual to recognize the objects placed in his or her hand without seeing. So, sensory association area. Sensory association area. So this one, the sensory association area, like as just we read, it helps to understand and to understand the shape and the roughness and what is, if you close your eyes and you touch something, the thing that the area in the brain that makes you understand what it is a sensory association area. And then we have the sensory speech area of Wernicke's. The Wernicke's area, which is area number 40. And this one is concerned with the understanding of speech. Broca's area was if you want to talk, if you want to give a speech, that one is related with Broca's area, area number 44 and 45. But this one is understanding a speech. When somebody is talking, the interpretation of that language and that speech is related to this area, area number 40, Wernicke's area, which is right over here. This one, 39 and 40, but mostly in area number 40. Understanding the speech. It's also called the sensory speech area. So there's a difference between motor speech and sensory speech. Motor speech is Broca's area, 44 and 45. If you want to give a speech, if you want to talk, it's related to that. But if you want to understand and interpret a speech, the sensory speech area is this one, number 40 of Wernicke's area. Then we have the primary auditory area. For primary and secondary auditory, there are two areas. And the primary and secondary auditory areas receive fibers from the medial geniculate body via the auditory radiation. So, and here some cranial nerves are also included in this for these areas, primary and secondary auditory areas for hearing. Then we have the visual areas, primary visual area and the secondary visual area. So the visual cortex receives afferent fibers, which are sensory fibers from lateral geniculate body via optic radiations. Visual cortex receives fibers from temporal half of the ipsilateral retina and the nasal half of the contralateral retina. So of the opposite field of vision. So we have the primary visual area and the secondary visual area. If we go back in that picture, here we have the primary visual area. Okay, yeah. So these are the functional areas of the cerebrum. And this is just from the lateral view. But in the next video, we'll talk about the medial view. So here there are. This is the frontal eye field, the premotor area. Then we have the primary motor area. This one over here, primary motor area. We have the primary somatosensory area. And then we have the visual association area, primary visual area, secondary visual areas. Then we have the Broca's motor speech area and sensory Wernicke's sensory speech areas, and primary and secondary auditory areas, and primary and secondary visual areas.